Great. Well, I'm very excited to talk about vernal pools. I'll talk a little bit about the species within them, and then a lot about the conservation of them. Vernal pool season is about 1 or 2 months away, depending on where in the state you live. Probably where you are, more like 2 or 3 away. But before we know it, especially as things start warming up, we're going to start seeing some movement. So right now, our vernal pools mostly look like this. They're covered over. And a vernal pool is just a body of water that fills each year and it usually dries in the summer. So this makes it different than a lake or a pond that usually have a permanent source of water that's coming in and out constantly. So I'm going to just start with defining what a vernal pool is. And the first thing I'll say is a vernal pool is hydrologically isolated. So right in this photo, what you're looking at is where a vernal pool would be in the spring, but I visited in the summer, so it's all gone. Vernal pools don't have a permanent inflow or outflow, so they don't have a stream attached to them. Um, they don't have underground spring feeding them, and they usually don't intersect with the water table, so they're not usually fed by groundwater. And so that means that they generally fill in the early spring, especially with snow melt and April showers. And then come summertime, usually in July or August, they dry up. I'll say that not all vernal pools do dry up. There are some that we call semi-permanent, where they might only dry during drought years. And there are permanent pools, permanent vernal pools, but they're pretty uncommon. And the main reason why this hydro cycle is so important is that it really reduces the predators. If you're a vernal pool, and you dry out every year, fish can't become established. And also the longer the hydro period of a pond is, the more diversity of invertebrates there are. So you have a lot more predaceous insects in lakes and ponds than in vernal pools because they can't overwinter in most vernal pools. And this all just makes them perfect nurseries for some species. And this is what vernal pools are in most people's minds. You go there and you find a lot of mosquitoes, but also they produce frogs and salamanders. So usually these these amphibians will crawl to the vernal pool, lay these large gelatinous eggs, and then leave the vernal pool. And these eggs have no defenses other than a layer of jelly, basically. And so these eggs would not survive if they were fish because they are just so easily eaten by everything. And then, of course, once they hatch into larvae, then if you had a ton of predaceous diving beetles, these would all get snacked up as well. And so the secret to the success of these species is that they breed early in the season before everything else is up and going, and they're out of the water before the water dries up, or else it's not really going to be successful. I'll also say what isn't a vernal pool. Farm ponds like this are not vernal pools. There might be frogs and stuff that do breed in them, but they usually are fed by a spring or some other permanent water source. And also the frogs that you find in them tend to be something like a bullfrog. Bullfrogs don't breed in vernal pools because they overwinter as tadpoles. They spend about 1, 2, or 3 years, depending on the climate, as tadpoles, so they can't live in a vernal pool. They also spend their entire life cycle as adults in the water so they can defend their young. If you're in a vernal pool, you're not defending your young at all. And then also swamps that are usually ground fed are not vernal pools. They may act as breeding grounds for some species, especially if you have little pockets of water that aren't accessible to fish. But just as a natural community, these are not considered a vernal pool. In Vermont, we focus on four primary amphibian species and then two invertebrates in vernal pools. Wood frog and spotted salamander are probably the most well known. Those are found statewide. Jefferson salamander is a little bit less common. It is more found in areas of the state with calcareous bedrock. It seems pretty sensitive to pHs. So Champlain Valley and some areas in the Connecticut River Valley, and spotted areas elsewhere. Blue spotted salamanders are more of a lowland species, so they're much more common in the Champlain Valley than elsewhere in the state. And then the two invertebrates we look at are fingernail clams, which are tiny little clams that live in vernal pools. They're really helpful because if you visit a vernal pool when it's dry and you look in the leaf litter, you might still find these. And so finding these in the leaf litter can be a way of helping identify a vernal pool even when there's no water. And then finally, fairy shrimp are tiny little shrimps that spend their entire life cycle in vernal pools. You can think of them as brine shrimp. They're very rare. We only know them from, I mean, less than 50 sites that have them in the state, well, less than 50 sites. They are an indicator typically of pretty clean water, but we don't know a whole ton about them other than the species we have and that they're in vernal pools. It's very only until recently we've only thought we had one species in the state, but as of last year we actually have three different species in the state, and we've only found that because we've sampled them at a ton of sites and then brought them into the laboratory to identify them closely. I guess I'll also note that two species you don't see here are spring peepers or newts. Those are not considered vernal pool specialists. They don't lay those large egg masses, and they can hide their smaller eggs better in like under reeds, and help camouflage them better. And so they are a lot more common, maybe some like those farm ponds that you don't see as many of these vernal pool species. And they will breed in vernal pools, but they're not the specialists that really rely on these ecosystems. Right now, our little friends are all underground. Wood frog here, and then I did include the spring peeper here. These are pretty unique in that they are called freeze thaw amphibians. So they have very high glucose levels in their blood. They pump their blood full of glucose and some nitrates and stuff, and dehydrate some of their most important cells, um, to reduce the water, and then they can actually freeze almost entirely solid because they have less water in their necessary body parts. Um, and then they're a little frogsicle, and so they're overwintering pretty close to the ground level, frozen completely frozen all the way through, just like spring peepers. Whereas our salamanders are down deeper. They're below the frost line, and they are usually in rodent burrows or maybe along roots where roots have some wiggle room. But they are down lower, underneath the freezing. Once they arrive and move to their vernal pools, they are pretty quick in, quick out. Only a couple nights of the year are they above ground. The salamanders only spend about 5% of their life above ground. Almost all their life is underground, and even wood frogs only spend a little bit of time in the water before dispersing to the upland. So when you're able to experience these nights, these call them big nights, these big migration nights, it is really cool. So this is a group of spotted salamanders breeding. This is called a salamander congress. And so it's just a bunch of salamanders there, probably a night in mid-April, coming up for air every so often. They don't have gills. And this is like a big mating ball. It's somewhat similar to what wood frogs do, but wood frogs don't form these same big clusters as much as kind of forming like tight, like get a grip on each other. Um, Thing that a lot of people might know vernal pools for, these big egg masses, the big gelatinous egg masses. Wood frog here on the left and Jefferson salamander here on the right. Very few defenses. And then because of all this food and biomass in one place, you do get a ton of predators. So fisher, barred owls are really, really common at vernal pools. They'll go and they'll eat the head off of some salamanders and leave the body, it seems sometimes. And then other hawks, it's the red-tailed hawk, but broadwing hawks are pretty common at vernal pools. Of course, things like raccoons, Bears and moose will use them for drinking water. And just this is all to say that they are extremely diverse and productive ecosystems. Uh, Beautiful picture on the left, and this is just the food web, a basic food web of the vernal pool. I'm not going to harp on it too much, but just know it's extremely interconnected and complicated because it's just a place where algae is formed in what would otherwise be a terrestrial environment. And so it gives a great opportunity for the sun to convert a great amount of energy into biomass and then eventually up the food chain. And this is definitely apparent in early spring when you go out, and it's almost like an oasis in a desert. We've had some pretty dry springs recently, and you're walking in the woods and the leaves are crunching under your feet. And these are just areas of water that would otherwise not be there. And you can almost think of it as a coral reef in the forest, just really small, really productive, with an outsized influence that impacts the landscape. So that's a quick overview of like just what vernal pools are as like a just uh, just what are they? But I think the really important thing is just how do you conserve them? Vernal pools have historically been underrepresented on our wetland maps because they're so small. If you don't go there at the right time of year, you won't encounter them. And even if you see one and you still want to fill it in to develop it, it's kind of hard to get caught doing that. And this is really readily apparent with all the satellite imagery you have, where this is a color infrared satellite imagery. So the red is chlorophyll. So this is taken probably during the late fall or early spring. So you can see all this red is evergreen trees, is conifers. This is deciduous forest. There's no leaves, so you're not seeing any conifer. And this right here is a telltale vernal pool sign. It might have a little bit of water in it, and so it might be in color infrared water, almost looks like a dark blue. And also it just might be a depression that's also being picked up. And you fast forward a little bit, and now there's a house there and two artificial bodies of water that might not have any of the structure needed for breeding, might be too hot, might not have the hydro period, might have too many predators. And so the first step to conserving these ecosystems is knowing where they are. And so this is where the Vernal Pool Atlas comes into play. This is a collaboration between us at the Vermont Center for Ecostudies and Vermont Fish and Wildlife. And about 10 years ago, we went through and we mapped about 5,000 potential vernal pools in the state using that color infrared imagery. So all these orange dots are potential vernal pools, whereas all the dark blue ones are confirmed vernal pools that someone has visited and observed egg masses. I'll just throw a note if you want to go look at this later. The URL is vpatlas.org. You can go to the website, click view pools at the top, and it'll bring you to a big map like this. I'll note that right now, Franklin County is definitely underrepresented. I do have several hundred more vernal pools to add to Franklin County this year that I've recently detected using some other methods. So I'm hoping to get those into the atlas sometime before things start melting. But all these orange dots are sites that we have identified as potential vernal pools, but they really can't be protected, or they can be protected, but it's hard to hold people accountable for violations if they are not identified and confirmed on the map. When you confirm a vernal pool on this map, it does also get added to the state wetland inventory to help ensure that down the road, say in 10, 15 years, if someone does try to develop the land, there's at least a record of a vernal pool occurring. This is a map of Norwich. Our town is just south of Norwich in White River Junction. And so we put a lot of effort into Norwich. So there's over 150 potential pools in Norwich. The black dots are sites that we have visited. We have confirmed egg masses, and we had landowner permission to include on the atlas. That's kind of a big hangup is you need landowner permission in order to formally map a pool onto the atlas. And then all the yellow dots are pools that either people have visited and we didn't have landowner permission for, or some that were detected remotely. And I imagine that a lot of the state has a lot of vernal pools. It's just historically we haven't detected them or reported them. And so I've gone through using some new technologies, taking satellite imagery and trying to detect where there are depressions in the ground, and then going and hopefully this season going out and confirming a bunch of these, which could in theory add, 5 or 6 vernal pools within a pretty small area. So after you kind of identified the vernal pools, as I mentioned, you need to field confirm them. You have to go out and identify that there's egg masses and get landowner permission. This is definitely the most time consuming part of things. If you're interested in learning more about this, I suggest this guide, the Maine Municipal Guide to Mapping and Conserving Vernal Pool Resources. It's a little bit out of date. It's from Maine. It's really applicable here. That's just a QR code if you want to check it out. It's just Google if you're interested. So once you find a vernal pool, what now? The first most important, in theory, the most important thing is you want to conserve the basin itself. The vernal pool basin is the area that floods in the spring. So in this vernal pool, you can see a faint line between kind of like fluffier, lighter brown leaf litter versus this mucky, wet leaf litter. So the first thing you want to do is conserve this mucky, wet area. If you're ever harvesting forestry, you never want to put any machinery in the basin that might alter the hydro period or compact things. And you don't want to remove any trees from this basin or add any trees. If like slash or anything falls into the basin, just leave it. But in general, you don't want to go and like tow trees into vernal pools to add more structure. So just on a grand scale, this looks like the small vernal pool depression here, no machinery, no management there. But as I mentioned earlier, things like salamanders only spend 5% of their life here. The other 95% of their life, they're in the upland. So the second most important thing is to conserve what we call the life zone. So that buffer area around the vernal pool where adult amphibians spend the vast majority of their adult life. We recommend a 400-foot absolute minimum. That applies, that will encompass most of the adults, but that doesn't apply for things like young individuals that might try and disperse between vernal pools. But as a general rule, for best practices, we suggest leaving a 400-foot buffer zone. And so in practice, what that looks like is, again, you have this vernal pool depression, a 100-foot zone, kind of we call this the protection zone. This is where you want minimal management to happen. And then the larger 400, 500-foot buffer area is the life zone. And you just want to maintain a good forest canopy layer over that to ensure that moisture levels and shade stays somewhat healthy in the understory. And just as a diagram, pre-treatment here, you see it's a pretty full forested area. Say you went through and did a forestry treatment, you would leave a 75% canopy cover in the buffer zone in that protection zone, and then about half canopy cover in the surrounding 400 or 500 feet. Again, this is a minimum. Ideally, these zones would be much bigger, but also I know that that's not realistic all the time. And I'll note that legally, there's only a 50-foot protection buffer for vernal pools from development. But for silviculture, there's really not great protections. So in theory, you could go through and essentially clear cut most of this if you wanted to. So these are best management practices. This is not legal advice here. This is just what it looks like as a map. I'm realizing now I gotta start talking quicker because we're getting low on time. And then one thing beyond the forestry aspect, I also just want to mention the impact of roads. Um, Amphibians, they're within this life zone, but they move to and from the vernal pool every spring. So if you throw a road in the middle, that's a really big buffer that impacts their migration. And so in this image I just showed, you might want to have, so there's the life zone that has the adult breeding population, but there's also younger individuals that might disperse between vernal pools before they're sexually mature. And so you want to try and maintain some type of connectivity between vernal pool sites. You put a road here, and you might have a massive source of mortality here that greatly restricts gene flow. So it really reduces the genetic diversity of these sites. And this is a study out of, I think, the UK. I think it's out of Europe, that shows how many cars per minute here and the probability of one individual getting killed. And even at 5 cars per minute, there was over 90% chance of an individual getting killed while crossing the road for a toad or a newt. Frogs had a slightly better chance of surviving just because they're quicker, but then something like a rabbit is just much higher. So just this is encouragement to consider just the entire life cycle of these amphibians and not just their breeding phase. And we've had some really great research recently published in Vermont. This is from University of Vermont with Matthew here, a good friend of mine. He was looking at in Moncton, they installed an underpass under a road where there was an extremely high level of mortality of blue spotted salamanders and some other salamanders in a massively important breeding site. And there was an 80% decline in mortality when they installed that underpass. I think it was a very expensive underpass in the hundreds of thousands of dollars, but that's because it was retrofitted. And I think at the local level, vernal pools are such a great opportunity to really benefit things because it's such a local scale issue. And say you are putting a new road in, you can install an underpass probably without adding a whole ton of cost as long as it's accounted for during the process. And in order to do that, we have to know where the amphibians are so that when we're designing these infrastructural things, we know where it needs protection. That's most of what I have. I will note, just if you're interested in learning more about this and maybe how to get involved at more of a local scale, I'm going to be doing a hour-long talk with the Association of Vermont Conservation Commissions on April 2nd at noon. I assume that'll be recorded as well. And I'm currently planning a series of field events, field trainings in April and May to hopefully encourage conservation commissions and other folks to get out and map their pools. Um, I don't have one scheduled in Franklin County yet, but that is on my hope list. So as the time comes, I'll start announcing those and I'll make sure to let you guys know when I have some Franklin County stuff scheduled. And just if you have anything else, my I don't have my personal email on here, but it's just ktolan at the same URL. If you have some Vernal Pool Atlas related questions, here's the email address. Vernal Pool Atlas, as I mentioned, vpatlas.org, and our website's here. Uh, I hope I didn't talk too fast. I had a lot to cover, and I really appreciate your time. And hopefully, at some point, meeting with you at down the road and engaging your local vernal pools. Well, thank you very much.
Thank
I
you,
have a
Kevin. That
question.
was great. Go
Thank
for
you.
it,
Yeah.
Jake.
Yeah, so you mentioned a lot of, maybe best management practices to protect the vernal pools and so on. And in that point, sometime in that conversation, I got a sense that there may be some legal regulations concerning any of this, or is it just best management practices?
So the legal regulation is a 50-foot buffer between development and a vernal pool. Um,
Okay, so who's monitoring that? I'm curious.
uh, be the Department of the DEC.
Yeah, so in most cases, well, I don't know if I should say in most cases, but in many cases, when somebody decides to build a house, DEC is probably not even connected at all. I mean, it's a local building permit, and you know, I mean, I don't want to get way down into the weeds here, but it's just kind of curious as a landowner, knowing, that there are plenty of vernal pools up in my sugar place, and I have no intention of ever developing it, but I'm just kind of, trying to understand what.
Yeah, there are definitely holes in the system. I'm not at all involved with like that with the legal aspect. My understanding is that there should be legally a 50-foot buffer.
Mhm.
I'd like to think that's enforced, but I also understand it's a hard thing because of the scale of these vernal
Yeah,
pools.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, yeah,
Extremely interesting. It's something before I got involved with this wild and scenic and uh, related to that. I used to trudge through vernal pools during the sugaring season towards the end and just think they were a nuisance, but now I have a different appreciation for them.
that's great. Yeah, they are just such neat ecosystems. Once you stop and look at them, you never see them the same way again.
Yeah.
I have a question. If we have wood frogs on our property, does that mean we might have vernal pools that we aren't aware of? Or like how far do they go from their vernal pools? Is the vernal pool, a mile away or
I'd say about a kilometer, so yeah, maybe half a mile. Um, they're not the most mobile of critters. And so I'd say at most, yeah, I'd say at most a mile. Like I think, yeah, like at most a mile. Um, I mean, wood frogs are very prolific, so they could be in skitter ruts, they could be in roadside ditches, anywhere, and even like they have about a 5 year life cycle. So even if only once every 5 years there's an area that floods and they have luck there, that could still have an ongoing local population.
and we do have like old logging roads on our property.
Yeah,
And there's parts where we just don't even go in the spring because it's so muddy.
yeah.
So perhaps
I,
that's
I
where they're
I'd say that's
breeding.
yeah, I said it's a great, I mean, that's a great thing. Like that'd be a great place to look. I think sometimes you might even find, if not a naturally occurring vernal pool, if there's like a berm that was built up, there might be an area that has started to flood. I'd say check back in the atlas sometime closer to the season, and hopefully I'll have all my new points updated, and maybe I'll be there. But also the vernal pool atlas is great because if you find a vernal pool that's not on there and you want to make sure it's included on the wetland inventory, you can fill out the data sheet yourself and submit it. It's really straightforward. Like there's only 4 species of egg masses you have to identify, and wood frogs are easy to pick out from the salamanders. And as long as you have landowner permission, it can be included. So, uh, yeah, I would love to talk further if you want to shoot me an email as the season draws closer.
Great.
Awesome. Well, yeah,
Kevin,
please.
I have
Yes.
a question about the gosh, one of the first graphics you showed with the salamanders being deeper this time of year, and you said that they would use small mammal burrows or roots. So do they not dig on their own?
They're very weak diggers.
Interesting.
Yeah, we did.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, the royal we, my previous supervisor Steve Fossio, did telemetry with them in Woodstock and like followed where they went for the winter, and yeah, it was almost entirely like rodent burrows and stuff like that.
Very cool. I also hadn't thought about the like flux of all of the egg masses and the critters being contained to the vernal pools and how the barred owls and everybody comes in and eats. That's a wonderful addition that I hadn't realized was a vernal pool as a source of food for larger animals. That
Yeah,
was great. Thank you.
yeah, it's a smorgasbord. It's a bunch of, and especially once you have little wood frogs coming out of the pool, like just a little tater tot hopping around the forest. Like anything that can catch a small frog like that would be happy.
Andrew, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks for this great presentation. It was really well done. I have a question about you mentioned the was it called the fingernail clam?
Yes.
I just this is a really simple question, but maybe harder to answer. But how do they survive the drying cycle of a? And I can imagine these other more mobile creatures surviving or finding pockets of water, but less mobile creature like a clam. How does that survive?
They just dig down to the leaf litter and get moisture
Really?
down there. Yeah. It's
Huh.
it's pretty incredible. And then you think about species like that, it's like how do they disperse? It's like they probably get picked up in like a duck or something and maybe get brought pool to pool. But yeah, those in yeah, fingernail clams is this there's a one specialist that only lives in vernal pools. And then fairy shrimp are just both incredible species that are so interesting.
And Kevin, I assume they're fingernail clams because they're that is a hand under that. So I
Yeah,
assume they are fingernail sized.
they
So
are. Yeah, they are
hard to
pinky nail
find.
size. They are tiny,
Yeah.
but
So
it's a great.
probably those of us that don't have training are going to have the best luck identifying vernal pools during vernal pool season.
Yes, I'd say that I mean, even for, it's so much easier to do it during the vernal pool season because you can count the eggs and be like, well, every female spotted salamander on average lays 1.7 eggs or 2 eggs, and then you can calculate the population size. But the most important thing for conservation is just get them mapped. Um, and even if you find, I mean, you can once you start looking, you start seeing them a lot. And you will be walking through a forest in the summer, you might see an area where it's like the leaf litter is just bedded down a bit more, and you flip a leaf over and it's just wetter. And that's also important for like salamanders and stuff during drought. And yeah, even this summer, if you go flipping cover in a vernal pool basin, you'll find all types of critters.
John?
Yeah.
Oh,
Just, are you aware of the Sheldon Elementary School?
so
As
So
John, you
uh,
were very broken up.
uh,
I'm going to mute you.
site.
I think he was asking if you're aware of vernal pool near the Sheldon Elementary School. And John, if you could type in the chat. Yeah, that's what Andrew just said.
Um, off the top of my head, no. But the Atlas should be just the place to just go scrolling and see where that would be.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, like I said, I have 3,000 sites that I need to add to the Atlas that we're gonna do this upcoming month. So I'm hoping that hopefully if it's not there now, it will be soon.
Excuse me, what's the window, the length of time a vernal pool will be around? I mean, are we talking a couple of weeks? I presume it has to do with what the weather's like too.
Yeah, so the vernal pools that will have the best luck, um, basically from snow melt until July or August.
Oh,
It takes about 2 months, say roughly 2 months, not exact, 2 months for um the eggs to to hatch and then metamorph. Longer than that, but it takes yeah, it takes sorry, I just got so caught up on my words. Yeah. I mean, the eggs are only there for about 2 months, and then the larvae are there after. So they'll still be there if you visit in the summer, but the egg season is just when it's easiest to identify them and count them.
so your window is about 2 months for any vernal pool.
Y- Yes, two
Yeah,
two prime months.
yeah.
And then you can
Thank
still
you.
visit and identify if you see a larvae. And if you see a tadpole, it's probably a wood frog, maybe a peeper or a green tree frog. But they'll still be there through the summer because they need to metamorph.
Yeah. Thank you.
Is it ever possible that a vernal pool is kind of it's hard to explain, like an overflow area from a brook? We have an area along our brook that when everything just goes rushing, it goes into this really very, very deep hole. But there is land between this hole and the brook, and that hole is always got water. Sometimes it's super deep, like several feet deep. It's always at least a foot deep. So would that be considered a vernal pool, or would that not really fall within?
It would, I'd say it would depend more on if the amphibians were using it. Like if it was being used, it totally could qualify. My main concerns would be there just might not be a huge population in the floodplain if there's not like the leaf litter and stuff for them to live in. And if it floods several times in the spring, do the egg masses just get flushed downstream every so often? So I'd say it could be, or just depend on if it's actually being used for successful breeding.
Because we definitely see frogs in there a lot.
Yeah, I'm
And
sure.
so,
I'm sure it's a great. Yeah, it's just going to depend on if the species are
yeah,
using it for egg masses.
okay, thanks.
Artificial vernal pools can be created. I'd say it's a careful balance, though. I think sometimes people are like, I'm going to create a vernal pool and rent a digger and dig out a hole, and it might not be in an area that has a big enough catch basin to maintain filled, and it might create a population sink. But if it's done correctly in an area that like has, the means of sustaining it, and it's not turned into a population sink, they can be extremely beneficial. I think also we see a lot of old farm ponds that have since been reclaimed by the forest that are great vernal pools. Just off the top of my head, over down in Rupert at Merrick Farm Center, I've been there a couple times, and they have a bunch of old farm ponds that are all artificially created, but now have populations of hundreds of salamanders just because they've been reclaimed by the forest. If they're done correctly, they can be very, very productive.
Great. Any last questions for Kevin?
Great. Well, thank you so much for having me. I'll just throw my contact info up there one last time.
Yeah, thanks for that link to the Vernal Pool Atlas. That'll be fun to
Definitely.
check out and see what's identified in spaces I've been.
Yeah. Great. Well, maybe I'll talk to some of you down the road, and have a great night, and hopefully you don't get hit too hard by the storm tomorrow.
Thank
Yeah,
you,
thank you.
Kevin.
We'll think about vernal pools.